Thank you.
Last but not least, I apologize in advance for the notes. I'm a note person. I'm so impressed with your ability to speak in that way, but here I am. Thank you so much. Thank you, Eric, Sandy, and the New Haven Chamber of Commerce. I'm honored to be here and participate in this important conversation. Thank you for having me. I never expected to be an advocate for public policy changes and research funding to help eradicate cancer. It wasn't on my radar, trust me. I practiced administrative environmental law in Connecticut for 20 years, and I loved my work, which included drafting environmental regulations for the Department of Environmental Protection and representing property owners whose land had been contaminated by corporate polluters. However, in my late 30s, I was diagnosed with a rare disease called Cushing's syndrome, and it left me with significant cognitive impairment. I had short-term memory and processing deficiencies, and I became disabled from the practice of law. I had my first breast cancer diagnosis just 3 years after my Cushing's diagnosis. And then 4 years after my first breast cancer diagnosis, I had a regrowth of a different type of breast cancer. Thankfully, I'm now in my 9th year with no evidence of disease. I eventually realized that the unique combination of my legal advocacy skills and my health history would allow me to help others by effectuating public policy changes that benefit patients and their loved ones. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity to make a difference. I've been an active volunteer with the American Cancer Society for over a decade. I began as a trained volunteer for the American Cancer Society's Reach to Recovery program, where I have the privilege of acting as a trusted mentor to women newly diagnosed with breast cancer as they navigate the complicated path through surgery and treatment. And now, I'm the state lead ambassador in Connecticut for the American Cancer Society's Cancer Action Network, known as ACS-CAN. ACS-CAN is the nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy affiliate of the American Cancer Society, and it relies on its thousands of volunteers representing every state in our nation who work every day to make cancer a national priority. As Connecticut State Lead Ambassador for ACS-CAN, I maximize its legislative impact, act as the primary volunteer contact for Connecticut's United States senators, participate in regular briefings on local, state, and federal issues, and am a volunteer spokesperson for advocacy issues. Many of the most important decisions about cancer are made outside of your doctor's office. They're made by your state legislature, in Congress, and in the White House. ACS-CAN holds lawmakers accountable for their words and their actions. We demand that our leaders not only talk about fighting cancer, but take real steps towards decreasing the number of people suffering and dying from cancer. I've now helped draft and advocated for numerous bills related to cancer and rare diseases that have become Connecticut law. I also sit on the Connecticut Legislature's Breast Cancer Awareness Working Group, which provided legislative proposals that will improve breast cancer awareness and early detection of breast cancer for underserved groups in Connecticut, and on the advisory board of RU Dense, which is a Connecticut nonprofit that educates women about dense breast tissue and advocates for the passage of state and federal dense breast notification laws. I look forward to our conversation this morning, and again, thank you for having me.
You have any questions? You know, we can stay with the informal theme, and I'm happy for people to stand up and ask questions. There's one rule, and the rule is it can't be a question that's too personal about your own medical situation or the medical situation of a family member. And I have to rush off after this, but I'm sure either Alvaro or I would be happy to talk to you at some point in time about those issues. But questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
With the genomic research that you're doing, have you come up with, I mean, you said that there were clinical trials that are now in.
What I was referring to are genomic screens, and that's when a tumor samples after surgery is analyzed for its DNA content and all the mutations are identified, and that might reveal that that specific type of tumor will be sensitive to a targeted therapy. And that patient will be likely to be enrolled in a clinical trial or be given that treatment if that's an option. But obviously that requires a certain level of expertise, first of all to run the test and then to interpret the results. So that's what the MIN Cancer Genomic Initiative was all about. It provided that level of expertise to all the oncology practices in rural Maine.
I understand now. I wasn't
Yeah,
sure.
sorry, I should have
No,
explained.
because I know that clinical trials there are many going on.
Yes.
And I know that there can be genetic engineering, and I didn't know whether or not the genomic testing that you did somehow attributed to that kind of research.
No, these are different things. So that's, cancer is really a disease of the DNA. It originates from defects or mutations, changes in the DNA sequence of a cancer cell. And so what these screens do is just catalog all of the mutation in the cancers and see if any of those changes are what we call actionable. So if there's a treatment that directly will target one of those changes. But as you said, a clinical trial, it's a very complex field to navigate because there's so many, and not every oncologist will have the expertise to navigate that complex system and identify the right clinical trial that their patient might be eligible to. So these tumor boards offer that level of expertise and support.
So are minorities do you have a good number of minorities who are participating in your study?
You're talking about ethnic minorities?
We'll get there in a second. Okay, because I'm going to make a comment and then I'm actually going to turn to you to comment on this a little further. You already touched on it. So think of when we look at the genome, it's like looking at the brain of the cancer cell. And when we're doing these screens, or what's often called tumor profiling, we're looking for genetic abnormalities that may give us a clue as to what the right therapy is that may have nothing to do with the genetic therapy of any sort. It may be a small molecule or an antibody therapy or something like that. And at this point in time, it's pretty standard in somebody who has advanced cancer of any sort, to do this tumor profiling. It has not turned out to be the answer to all problems. And in certain diseases, like lung cancer, it's absolutely critical to have this genomic profiling because it really subdivides lung cancer into many different types, some of which may be only 1% of all lung cancer, but for which we have specific therapies. In breast cancer, there are fewer examples where the therapies work, but what this is trying to get at is whether we can identify additional areas where that would be effective. And my guess is, although I don't know this, but you can tell me if I'm right, is that the study that SWOG is doing, and SWOG is one of the big national cooperative groups, is actually testing the test. And so testing whether in fact it's better for patients to have their case discussed by an expert panel versus getting standard care. Because ultimately, if we want to justify these kinds of expert panels, we have to demonstrate that they actually really are useful. In terms of clinical trials, there are hundreds and hundreds of different clinical trials for patients with cancer, which are actually quite well cataloged in federal databases. One of the challenges we have, and it's a big challenge, is that individuals who are Black, individuals who are excuse the term Hispanic, Latinx, spanning the broad range of populations, Native Americans are typically not included in those trials to the same degree that white individuals are. Some of that has been about simply not asking. Some of it has been a lot of white doctors asking a lot of non-white patients about trials and understandable mistrust. The reasons go on and on. But it is really important that we change this. And I'm going to let you pick up on that.
Yeah. So
in terms of why, among other reasons.
So what Dr. Weiner was saying is kind of what I was alluding to before. Sorry, it's a respecting. I'm so sorry. Yeah, it's culturally means respect. What we were talking about just now is alluding to what I was saying before. Is what we've realized that there is an underrepresentation of the minorities in the clinical trials. And what we've realized is that genetically we're not all the same. We're certainly different, right? And taking into account these genetic differences may allow us to identify populations who may actually get even more benefit than the general population, but at the same time allows us to identify patients who are increased risk of toxicities from the treatment. Like for where I came from, there was some research being done that had identified that for this medication called Taxotere or docetaxel that we give commonly for breast cancer, African American patients have actually 2 SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms that embedded in their healthy DNA that increases the likelihood of developing chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy, which is not nerve damage or numbness and tingling. So that's how do we incorporate that into clinical practice, right? Now that we know about this, and the barriers to the clinical trials are not only from the patients, because we know that they're there, right? So culturally, we don't trust the medical community, right? Because we feel like we may be guinea pigs, right? And I've been told that. I don't want to be a guinea pig. And then there's also the financial barriers, the transportation barriers that I was mentioning, and other stuff, right? So for instance, for them to come, I go back to IU, Indiana University is in Indianapolis. The larger community of Hispanics is about 2 hours away. So in order for them to participate in clinical trials, they would have had to find somebody to take care of their kids or their parents, right? Because elderly care is important for the Hispanic and other underserved populations. And then they will have to travel 2 hours, get their cancer treatment under the trial, and then go back. So that's difficult. But then the other thing is the patient or the physician who's offering the trial. And that's exactly what you told me when I first met you. It was the face of medical disparity should not be a blonde, Ivy League trained physician. It should be somebody that looks like them, talks like them, acts like them, right? So cultural congruence is huge when we offer that to our patients, because that way we get to gain their trust. Right? And as I was saying before, in my experience, a lot of the African Americans or Asian American Pacific Islanders did not want to participate in the trial that I was doing because it just didn't look like them, and so they were kind of mistrusting. And then finally, the third point is also how aware are physicians about clinical trials. So we've realized that a lot of the times in the community center, which is where the majority of patients are seen, patients are seen in the academic center where things start getting out of hand, and then they get referred to the subspecialist, right? But a lot of the time they're seen in the community cancer centers. And so there, physicians may not be aware of the clinical trials, or maybe are just not commonly practiced. So there's a variety of reasons why patients are not enrolled in the clinical trials. And there's clear evidence why they should be enrolling, right? We know all this much, but what do we do about it? And that's what we're trying to overcome.
Thanks. I'm going to call upon Linda in just 1 second, and you can have 10 seconds to think about anything you want to think about. But I just want to make one point, which is that our knowledge as a result of people like Francesca of the basic science of breast cancer and cancer in general is so phenomenal that it is almost criminal at this point if we do not push for clinical trials that will translate those findings into clinical practice, because there is no treatment that goes from Francesca's lab to my vein without a big clinical trial step in between, or it doesn't all have to be intravenous, but clinical trials are absolutely key, and we really do need to push for funding for them, and we can't turn all that over to the pharmaceutical industry. There is a real role for nationally supported, federally government supported trials. Linda, I'm sorry. For this.
I was diagnosed in 2008, and in 2008, generally across the United States, if you had a 2.5 centimeter malignant breast tumor like I had, you were thrown directly into a chemotherapy protocol. Do not stop. Do not pass go. You go right into chemo. I was really fortunate. I had an oncologist who knew of something called an Oncotype DX test. And he realized that if I went into chemotherapy, I would probably never have even a chance of recovering from the brain damage that I had incurred from Cushing syndrome. So he was looking at the patient in front of him, and he knew that chemotherapy is scary for every woman. Long-term impacts, short-term impacts, we all know about them. For me in particular, it would have been life-altering, because I probably would not have been able to be here today with you all. I probably would not have had my speaking function at all, because I had complete aphasia. So he sent my pathology to a lab called Genomic Health, and I received the Oncotype DX. And that provided a score of 0 to 100. And 0 meant that you did not have an aggressive tumor and you wouldn't react well, you wouldn't need chemotherapy. Higher numbers meant that you would need a chemotherapy protocol and that it would probably be life-saving for you. I was really happy to get a low
15.
score on this test. I got a 0.
0.
So that answered that. And so everyone knew chemotherapy was not appropriate for me. It was one of the happiest days of my life. There are 2 things I want to talk about. At that point, it was really new in this protocol. And so I wasn't charged. There was no charge. They were trying to collect a database. You could probably speak to that more. But there was no insurance. Insurance wasn't covering it, but it didn't matter. They wanted these samples. They wanted this information for their database. So I wasn't charged, but this is a really expensive test. Maybe one of you can say how much it is. I don't know, but I know it's incredibly expensive. Now that biomarker testing, which is now how lay people refer to this, is more common, of course they're charging for it. Of course these tests are causing anxiety for people like me, because they're not generally covered by insurance. Some of them are, a lot of them aren't. ACS-CAN sees this, and we're working on it. So in Connecticut, we're pushing for a biomarker bill that will require all health insurers to cover the cost of biomarker testing. That's number one. And then when it gets to clinical trials and diversity in clinical trials, I'm also going to speak to that, because in the testing for the Oncotype DX, the clinical trials, there were very few Black women. And so that test was generally just tested on white women, like me. I benefited from that. A lot of privilege standing before you today, and I acknowledge that. Now, the NIH, the National Institute of Health, is realizing that that test doesn't apply equally to Black women. And so a score of 25 or 24 that might indicate to a white woman that she doesn't need to have chemotherapy isn't accurate for a Black woman. And they're beginning to see Black women who are relying on those scores dying in greater numbers than white women. And it is just one example of how important it is to have diversity in our clinical trials. And then I'll move on to one more thing, and then I'll sit down, which is one other really important action that Cancer Action Network is taking right now, and that's called, it's federal, and it's called the Diverse Trials Act. And it's going to allow funding so that people who can't afford to participate in clinical trials, who live far away from clinical trials and can't get there, might be able to get the computer technology so that they can participate. We want to make sure that no matter where you live, no matter what the color of your skin, any issue should not prevent you from participating in a clinical trial. And so the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network is working really hard to get this Diverse Trials Act passed at the federal level.
Thanks. Additional questions? Yes. Hey.
Good morning. I wanted to thank you for speaking. I had a specific question. I know we talk about representation and diversity very broadly, but I would like to know, especially for Dr. Melendez, if you can share a story about a particular patient or a moment in your practice where seeing someone who looks similar to you made them feel more comfortable and more willing to be open about what they're going through.
So that's I do this I see this every day that I'm in clinic, right? I'm in clinic 3 days a week, and I would say the majority of my patients are of Hispanic descent. In Hartford, most of them are Puerto Rican, right? So, like I was saying, culturally we're different. Even linguistically we're different, right? My expressions, even my words mean totally different things, right? So, for instance, in El Salvador we have something that says ahorita, which means right now, right? For them, ahorita means further down the road, right? So, when I first joined Hartford Healthcare, I had to almost learn how to speak Puerto Rican, right? I was fluent in Spanish and French, but I had to speak Puerto Rican in order to be able to incorporate this. And one, for instance, I have several stories that I could share, but for instance, one of them is I have this young 42-year-old woman with a metastatic triple-negative breast cancer who is now on 4th line of treatment, who is struggling, right? And even though she's had expert opinions at several of our bigger cancer centers around, right? Boston, New York, she still comes back to me and says, I want to get treated by you. Because at the end of the day, the fact that she can linguistically and culturally connect with me, she understands that, number one, she trusts me that I'm not going to experiment on her, right? Legally, I can't anyways. But then the other thing is culturally. So I understand, without her having to say it, what's important for her at the end of the day, right? And so that's what we're trying to, and at the same time, honor for other patients. And I know, for instance, the American Cancer Society, or certainly ASCO, is trying to increase the cultural diversity of the providers, right? To kind of just foment that cultural congruence.
But we have a problem because, at least in a survey 3 years ago, and I doubt that it's so dramatically different now, that about 2.5% of oncologists in the United States were Black, and fewer than 5% were Latinx or Hispanic. And that doesn't match the population. And you can be sure that just trying to compete for those people isn't the answer. The answer, of course, is to train more people, but that takes time. And I think we have to both spend a great deal of energy focused on making sure we're training the right young doctors and other health professionals. And at the same time, I think we have to try to make sure that people who look like me, are trained as well as we can be to be culturally sensitive and be able to take care of a whole mix of people. And ultimately, I think that's going to be critical as well. And it's certainly, what we have to do in the short term. The other thing we can do in the short term is that, we have a little bit more flexibility in terms of the makeup of the nursing community and individuals who are, in some cases, nurse practitioners and for that matter, physician assistants. And they're very much part of the oncology workforce. And so by incorporating a multi-racial, multi-ethnic team, or incorporating those people in the team, I think we also help. But it's a real problem. I think we're probably going to have to end. I personally want to thank all of our panelists who I enjoyed spending time with, enjoyed connecting with you again, and thank all of you. It's been really great for me to be back in New Haven and back in Connecticut, and being able to spend time with all of you is really great. So thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Appreciate it. Everyone on the panel, thank you so much. I'll just leave everyone with that we do have our Women's Achievement Awards for the Quinnipiac Chamber coming up on November 9th, and our Big Connect Expo here in downtown New Haven on November 17th. There's tours here of the Cambria Hotel, so if you want to stick around for that, please do. And then again, thank you to our Healthcare and Life Science Council. I know we have many members that are here to help put together this programming and many other programs that we'll have throughout the next year. Hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you all.